I'll never forget that night. The night my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. While my only daughter was lying on an operating table fighting for her life, I sat alone in the hospital's cold waiting room, gripping the edges of the chair so tightly my hands went numb. Every second felt like an eternity. Every beep from the monitors behind those closed doors was like a hammer pounding against my chest. And where was her husband? The man who swore in front of God and both families that he would love her, protect her, and never leave her side. He wasn't there. He wasn't praying with me. He wasn't holding my hand. He wasn't pacing the corridors, asking doctors for updates. No, he was out on a yacht, laughing, drinking, dancing, celebrating his freedom. Freedom from my dying daughter. When I saw the photos, yes, the photos that one of his so-called friends posted online, I felt something snap inside me. My chest burned with rage, hotter than fire. I clenched my fists so hard I could feel my nails cut into my skin. That night, as I watched my daughter slip closer to death and her husband clink glasses on a yacht, I made myself a promise of revenge. And trust me, I kept it. I was a man who learned to be two people at once, mother and father, steady hand and warm voice. When her mother died, I remember the first morning I had to braid her hair and pack her lunch with trembling fingers. I learned to sew a missing button, to tie ponytails, to calm nightmares at 3 a.m. with the clumsy lullabies I made up. There were years when my alarm woke me before dawn, and the sun went down before I stopped working. I cooked, cleaned, and still showed up at school recitals with a tired smile. I worked jobs that left my back aching and my hands calloused. I fixed pipes, drove a delivery van, painted houses, anything that kept food on the table and the lights on. Once, when the heater broke in winter, I slept on the floor for a week so she could have the warm corner of the couch. I missed dates, birthdays, early mornings, late nights, but I never missed being there when she needed me. I sold things I loved, a watch I'd had for 20 years, then my wife's old bracelet, then finally my wedding ring, each piece traded for a hospital bill or a school fee. People called me stubborn. I called it love. I'd rather eat beans for a month than hear her ask for something I couldn't give. There were small victories that felt like gold. Her laughing so hard at something silly that she snorted, her hand slipping into mine at a crowded fair, the night she graduated and hugged me so tight I could taste tears. I taught her to tie her shoelaces, to balance a bicycle, to stand up when others tried to push her down. Those small lessons were my legacy. We had rituals, Sunday tea on the balcony, a cheap movie every Friday, the way she'd sneak popcorn into my old shirt sleeve when we watched comedies. Loneliness was a constant companion, but it was the quiet kind I accepted. I was too busy building for her to be crushed by it. I learned to find joy in thrift store treasure, and the glow in her eyes when I surprised her with a new book. I paid for tutors and saved for college fees while sleeping on whatever time remained. I planted seeds and hoped they'd grow into her future. There were nights I cried alone in the bathroom, letting the water hide my shame at not being enough, then wiped my face and went back to be her rock. Friends drifted away when life demanded more of me. Parenting became my whole world, isolation wrapped in purpose. I took pride in the small things, the way she folded her shirt just like I showed her, the recipe she copied from my crude handwriting, the way she called me old man, with a laugh that warmed me. Her first heartbreak felt like my own. I sat on the edge of the bed and let her sob into my shoulder until the moon moved and the dawn came. When she got sick, I became a student of illness, learning doctors' jargon, memorizing schedules, cajoling nurses for help, praying in a language I'd never spoken before. I sat up nights watching her chest rise, counting breaths like they were precious coins I could spend to keep her alive. I missed promotions, holidays, friends' weddings, but every missed thing was a promise kept to her. I would be there. There were times of quiet triumph, the day she earned a scholarship, The first job interview where she walked in confident, her smile a mirror of all we'd sacrificed for. I told myself the sacrifices were easy because love made them light. In truth, they were heavy, but gladly carried. Those small joys, a shared cup of tea, an inside joke, the smell of her hair after the rain, were the anchors that kept me steady. So when I looked at the man she married, I saw more than a husband. I saw someone who stepped into all that I was, who promised to be the partner I'd fought so hard to give her. I trusted he would be the warmth I could no longer provide every single second. I believed he would be the someone to share the long nights and the dull mornings. That is why his absence the night she fought for her life cut deeper than any wound. It felt like a betrayal not only of her, but of every sleepless night I had ever borne. The betrayal began like a leak you don't notice until the floor is soaked. At first it was small, a missed dinner, a late return from work, an offhand excuse that sounded rehearsed. Traffic was a nightmare, sorry, he'd say, smile quick and practiced, while my daughter's eyes searched his for something softer. I felt the first prickle of worry, then shame for feeling it. I told myself, young men change, marriages wobble. I waited. Then the excuses hardened into absence. He stopped coming to parents' evenings, stopped answering hospital calls when tests ran late. One evening I caught him counting receipts at our kitchen table like they were trophies. "We can't afford everything," he muttered when I asked what he was doing. My stomach dropped, not because of the money, but because of the tone. "We can't afford everything" sounded less like caution and more like judgment. She told me in whispers, late at night, when guilt made her brave enough to speak. "Dad, he says I'm dragging him down. He says I ruined the life he wanted." I remember the exact words he used when she confronted him about appointments. He looked at her as if she were a problem to be fixed. "I didn't marry you to be your nurse," he spat once, the syllables sharp and cold like broken glass. Shock hit me then, a physical thing that made my hands go numb. I stared at him as if I could find the man I thought I knew under that voice. My daughter went quiet after that. The color left her face like someone had sucked it out. She stopped laughing, the way she used to. Disbelief came next. I kept waiting for apology, for the husband to remember the promises he'd made in front of our families. He never did. Instead, he started hiding calls, deleting messages, slipping out at odd hours with that smug look of a man who thinks he can keep two lives. There were small humiliations that stung worse than any shout. The way he rolled his eyes when she reached for his hand in public, the way he'd answer her questions with impatience. Once at a family lunch, he raised his glass and joked about keeping up appearances, and everyone laughed, like cruelty dressed as humor. Sadness settled in like a fog. I watched my daughter shrink into herself, and I felt my chest ache in a way I hadn't known possible. I tried to talk to him, to reason with the man who shared our roof. "Where do you think you're going?" I asked one night when he grabbed his jacket. He looked at me with thin politeness. "Out. With friends. Don't wait up." Those two sentences felt like a verdict. I remember sitting at the kitchen table afterward, my hands around a cold cup of tea, feeling utterly abandoned. Disbelief turned into a slow, burning anger when I discovered charges on our account. Expensive dinners, gifts, a deposit for a yacht trip with his name on the confirmation. I held the confirmation printout while my heart tried to repair itself and failed. He had been spending money like he owned it, like our bills were someone else's problem. Humiliation followed. Friends who once respected our family started offering polite smiles when they saw him, as if they could smell trouble and pretended not to. Then the night of the surgery arrived. My world narrowed to the sterile smell of the hospital, the white noise of the monitors, the way the overhead lights made the waiting room feel like a place outside of time. A neighbor came in, pale, phone in hand. "They're on a yacht," he whispered. "Look." I saw them, laughing under string lights, glasses raised. My daughter's husband smiling into a camera while my daughter lay inside a room full of moss. Chines fighting for breath. At first I couldn't feel anything but a strange, floating unreality. The pictures scrolled and scrolled, and my stomach turned as if I were watching someone else's life. Sadness crashed over me in waves. I folded into it like a man folding paper until he is nearly nothing. Then the disbelief came back. How could he be so cold? How could he choose a party when her life hung in the balance? Anger grew like frostbite, slow, inexorable, and then searing. My hands trembled. I pressed them to my mouth to stop the sound that wanted to tear out of me. I remember dialing his number and letting it ring until it went to voicemail. I played his recorded laughter from those photos in my head and tasted bile. When I finally spoke to him, it was not with reason. "How could you?" I asked, voice raw. He sighed, bored. "People need to live, old man. Not everyone wants to be trapped." Those words were a strike. They stripped everything I had protected. My daughter's dignity, the years I'd bled to give her a life, and threw the pieces on the floor. I felt humiliated not because others saw me as weak, but because the man who should have guarded my daughter's life had chosen spectacle over compassion. That slow build, neglect, greed, coldness, public flaunting, tightened around me until I could see only one shape in front of me: betrayal. By the time the surgeon came out, my face was hard. Shock had long dissolved into something else. The sorrow was a stone in my chest, and anger, hot and clear, had become my compass. I left the hospital not as a broken man, but as a man who had been stripped of illusions, and with that clarity came a vow I could not ignore. I sat in the hospital corridor until the tiles blurred into a single cold plane beneath me. The night lights hummed like a distant storm, and every footstep sounded like a countdown. At first, I was a hollow thing waiting for news, a father on autopilot, repeating the same prayers because the old ones felt safer. Grief sat beside me like a heavy coat I couldn't shrug off. It muffled the world and made breathing a chore. I watched parents come and go, clutching takeaway cups, folding and unfolding the same worried gestures, and all I could think of was her chest under that sheet, rising and falling under machines. Images of her childhood kept flitting through my mind. Scraped knees, a crooked tooth I kissed back into place, a laugh that used to fill our tiny kitchen. Every memory felt priceless and fragile, like glass beads I had strung my life around. Then those yacht photos slid into the frame of my grief, like a hand shoved right through a picture. Laughing faces, clinking glasses, the swagger of a man who'd already decided her life was expendable. My chest filled with an animal sound I didn't recognize at first. It wasn't only sorrow anymore, it was something colder, a sharpening around the edges. I thought of every night I slept with one ear open so I could hear if she called, every extra shift I took, every pride I swallowed so she could rise a little further. Was this what all those sacrifices were for? To be treated as a stepping stone towards someone else's amusement? Anger rose slow at first, like a leak from somewhere high in the house, then quickened into a flood that wanted to sweep everything away. I could have screamed. I could have smashed the chair beside me. Instead, I sat very still and let the fury organize itself like a machine whirring to life. The grief that had been raw and shapeless found a new shape, a hot, focused line pointing at him. My mind ran through the ledger of wrongs, missed nights, cruel words, the way he'd measured love by convenience and not by blood. "I kept you," I said aloud into the empty corridor, more to name the truth than to accuse the air. A nurse passed, glanced at me with polite concern, and moved on. Nobody understood that something inside me had been recalibrated. I closed my eyes and felt each beat of my heart as proof that I was still capable of action, not only mourning. There was a clarity that arrived with exhaustion, the kind that strips away excuses and makes you see the bones of a decision. I thought of my daughter's face, pale and small against the sheets, and the shame she must have felt at being treated like baggage. Enough. The word came up from some place that was not my voice but felt like it had always been there. Simple, absolute, final. Not a momentary flare, but a line drawn in the sand between what I would tolerate and what I would not. The room of my mind filled with plans, not frenzied or petty, but deliberate and cold, because fury without direction is just noise. I would not let this be another sorrow that taught me only how to hurt. I would make it a turning point. Not for revenge's sake alone, but to reclaim the dignity stolen from my daughter and from every quiet sacrifice I had made. I pictured him waking up to a life rearranged, to consequences he had never imagined, and the image steadied me like a lighthouse does a ship. My hands stopped trembling. The numbness in my fingers receded and was replaced by a steadier kind of strength. I whispered into the sterile air, "You wanted freedom? Fine. I'll show you the cost of abandoning what you promised to protect." It wasn't about spectacle. It was about justice carved out with patience and precision. I rose from the chair as if I'd been given back a body that knew what to do. The decision felt older than me and truer than anything I'd felt in years. Outside, the world went on indifferent, but inside me a new weather had settled, purpose mixed with righteous fire. I folded the grief into a tool and the anger into a plan. I promised myself and her that I would not rest until the scales were balanced. "Enough," I said again, louder this time, and the word echoed down the hallway like a promise, not just to myself, but to the man who had chosen a party over a life. "I will make him pay," I vowed, every syllable a stone placed in the foundation of what would come next. I moved like a man who had learned to keep his mouth shut and his eyes open. First, I catalogued everything. Dates, conversations, debts, the small humiliations tucked into the margins of our lives. I made a list on a legal pad and numbered the wounds so they wouldn't blur into one another anymore. Not the wild, shouting kind of list, the surgical sort. Facts, receipts, screenshots, names, times. Then I reached out quietly. Not to people who would cheer, but to people who could act. An old friend at the paper, a retired accountant who smelled numbers like truth, a lawyer who owed me a favor from years back. I learned to ask questions that didn't sound like questions. Casual, polite, the kind strangers tolerate at a bus stop. From the accountant, I learned about discrepancies, invoices that didn't add up, phantom payments that lined someone else's pockets. From the lawyer, I learned what documentation would force an inquiry. Nothing flashy, just forms that could not be ignored. I spent evenings sitting with my daughter's medical bills spread like a map, tracing routes of money that didn't belong to her, and certainly not to us. I hired a private investigator, not to break laws or break bones, but to follow paper trails and gather witness accounts that people forget until reminded. The investigator called me with names at odd hours. His voice was careful, like someone carrying glass. I watched the man who had humiliated us on social media, and I watched the cracks that formed when his empire leaned on rotten boards. Patience became my ritual. I learned to wait in the shadows of other people's mistakes and let them reveal themselves. I positioned documents where they would be seen by the right eyes. A copy to the journalist friend, another to the lawyer, one quietly slid to a banker who had been suspicious already. I cultivated a small web of allies, not dramatic scenes of conspiracy, but pragmatic, tired people who liked fairness and hated being lied to. A former employee of his, ashamed and ready to be heard, handed me an email thread that smelled like betrayal. I printed it and felt my hands steady for the first time. I didn't announce anything. I rehearsed my sentences for phone calls the way I used to rehearse bedtime stories. Clear, calm, unhurried. I learned when to be loud and when to be silent. A whisper to the press, a formal complaint to the bank, a demand letter from a lawyer that would bruise pride more than flesh. I set small traps of truth, a carefully worded question at a shareholders' meeting, a quietly leaked photo to a gossip column, a subpoena quietly prepared and waiting. There were nights I sat at my kitchen table, not plotting violence but plotting exposure, timelines, press releases, legal windows that would not close. I kept the family believing I was only there at the hospital and at home. Secrecy was the armor that kept their pain from turning into spectacle. I rehearsed my face for the day I would confront him, not a mask of hatred, but the worn, honest face of a man who had been wronged and was tired of pretending. Every move was measured because revenge without restraint is just self-destruction. I wanted consequence, not chaos. Sometimes I tested the weather. A rumor nudged into the right inbox, a quiet phone call that made him flinch like a story had teeth. I never touched his accounts directly. I let the authorities, the legal system, and public pressure do the heavy lifting. I was the one who fed them the pieces. My friends asked if I was sure. I told them I was not interested in petty revenge. I wanted the truth to stand where lies once stood. There were pauses between strikes, long, deliberate silences, so when things fell apart, it would be complete and undeniable. And always, beneath the scheming and the evidence, there was the small private vow I whispered into my pillow, to rest, or dignity to my daughter, and to reclaim the nights I had given up for her. You might be wondering what the final thread was, the single move that would tip everything. I'll tell you this, it wasn't a single thing. It was a sequence, perfectly timed, with people who knew how to pull levers he hadn't even seen. For now, I'll keep that one card close to my chest. Let the question sit with you. When a man has nothing left to lose, what will he risk to right a life that was stolen from him? The first blow I struck was the quietest. A simple email to the journalist friend I'd trusted, with attachments labeled plainly, dates, transactions, screenshots. He called me the next morning with a voice that sounded like a man waking up to sunlight through cracked glass. "This is something," he said. "I can run it." When the article went up, it didn't scream. It threaded itself through the feeds like a slow poison. Local husband parties, his wife in surgery, financial irregularities found. At first he laughed it off, posture cocky in videos, answering interviews with the practiced charm that had once fooled me. That was mistake number one. While the public stared, the more private wheels began to turn. The bank that had been quietly watching his accounts called our lawyer. Suddenly, transfers that had been invisible were frozen. He woke one morning to a notification. An auditor wanted a meeting. Panic for the first time painted his face. He had never learned how to be frightened by paperwork. Then came the twist I'd been waiting for. The mistress. She had been a page in his story I hadn't expected to flip. But people who live in the shadow always have reasons to step into light. She walked into my investigator's office with trembling hands and an envelope. "I don't want to be part of this anymore," she said. Inside were messages, voicemails, the kind of private proof that becomes poison in the wrong hands. I didn't parade her. I listened. I promised safety. From her I learned things I couldn't have imagined. Contracts he'd forged, payments siphoned through shell companies, threats to anyone who'd ask questions. Another twist. A business partner who'd once laughed at our small problems received a subpoena and decided he'd rather be clean than complicit. He flipped. He handed over ledgers that made my evidence a chain rather than scattered links. The yacht photos that had been his trophy turned into the key image. A video clip surfaced. One of his friends had drunkenly recorded him bragging about how cheap it was to replace a sick wife. It played across screens and in the courtroom like a verdict. I remember the first time I watched his face when those clips looped on the newsfeed. Color drained, arrogance cracked, the smile died. He looked like a man reading the last page of a book he'd hoped would never end. Authorities began to move. Not because I wanted violence, but because the law was a tool, and I had given it the sharp edge of truth. Investigations, audits, interviews, each one another rung down the ladder he'd been climbing. There were moments I'd rehearsed and moments that surprised me. A longtime client, furious at being lied to, canceled contracts live on air. A charity that had accepted his donation publicly cut ties. His sponsors withdrew, one by one. He tried to fight back with lawyers and press statements. He hired people to spin narratives, to call me a bitter old man with an axe to grind. The world has always loved a comeback story. This time, it didn't buy it. Then came the sting I'd kept in my back pocket. The recorded phone call where he arranged to be seen at a gala while she had a follow-up operation scheduled. He'd been careless, overconfident, and in that call, he sounded small. The courtroom was not a battlefield of theatrics for me. It was a theater where truth could be presented with surgical calm. Witnesses I'd helped persuade told their stories. Paperwork clicked like dominoes. He pleaded for deals, for leniency, for anyone to tell him how to fix a life he had unmade. But apologies poured late and thin. They don't mend the night she woke alone in fear. Public humiliation arrived in waves. Interviews where he stammered, messages from people he had wronged. The echo of his own laughter in the Yacht video turned against him. His friends stopped returning calls. Even his lawyer's tone shifted from confident to cautious. There was a moment, sitting across from him in a packed hearing room, when he looked at me and asked with a small, hoarse voice, "Why are you doing this to me?" I let the silence be the answer. I didn't give him the script. He knew. He had lived it. His company's board voted him out. Banks called in loans. Where once he'd had leverage and swagger, he now had unpaid invoices and lawyers who guarded their time like priests guarding relics. The mistress, who had been hurt and used, stood in court with dignity and told the truth. The partner who'd flipped testified. Even small vendors testified about missing payments. The house of cards collapsed not with a bang, but with the sound of accounting ledgers being opened. I didn't revel in spectacle. I watched with a steady heart as the machinery of consequence ground on. I had wanted him exposed. I had not wanted blood spilled. The law delivered a punishment fitting the crime: financial ruin, public disgrace, and a legal settlement that protected my daughter's future. On the day he signed the settlement, he was a different man, hollowed out, awkward with remorse, like someone learning to walk after losing a limb. He offered apologies that sounded like rehearsed lines, and I let them fall into the room like rain on pavement. But the crowning two W's, the one that satisfied a quieter part of me, came when the people he'd used for status turned away. Invitations stopped. A silence replaced his name in places that once welcomed him. The social currency he'd spent on cruelty evaporated. What he lost wasn't just money. It was the illusion that he could treat people like props and still hold a life together. He lost the trust that had been currency he never learned to earn. My daughter watched from the sideline as justice, not vengeance in some brutal sense, but accountability, unspooled. Her tears were not of triumph, but relief, slow and healing. When I finally stood before him, not in the courthouse but in the old living room where he'd once promised forever, I didn't shout. I didn't need to. I looked at him the way a man looks at weathered wood that has been burned and left to stand. "I didn't want to ruin you," I said softly. "I wanted you to stop hurting her." He had nothing to say that mattered. His empire was gone, and with it all the small cruelties that had been hidden by fancy dinners and bright lights. In the end, he was exposed, punished, and left to rebuild in a world where his choices followed him like a shadow. He paid, not with blood, but with every thin thing he had counted as success. And for me, that was enough. The days after the storm felt oddly ordinary, as if the world had taken a breath and decided to go on without noticing the small earthquake that had shaken our lives. I watched headlines die down and phone calls slow. The noise that had once fed itself on outrage thinned into quieter things: appointments, prescriptions, the soft hum of the refrigerator. My daughter came home from the hospital with a gauze strip and a suitcase of careful promises from doctors. She walked slower, but she walked, and that was everything. She slept more. She laughed less at first, as if her laughter had to learn its way back into her chest. I let her find it in her own time. When she reached for my hand, I felt the years fold together, the nights I'd spent awake, the meals I'd skipped so. She could eat, the prayer said under breath, and for a moment the world righted itself. There were awkward moments, too. Friends who didn't know where to look, relatives who whispered that justice had been served, but spoke it like a hollow consolation. We rebuilt in small, practical ways. I met with lawyers to secure what remained of our finances, arranged counseling, and sat through boring meetings that felt like armor for the future. There were offers of interviews and invitations to speak, but I turned most of them down. I had wanted the truth to be known, not to become a spectacle. Sometimes I caught myself scanning the horizon for the shadow of what had been lost, a life I had hoped for my daughter that had been derailed, and then I would look at her, and that longing would soften. Peace came slowly, not as a sudden calm, but as a lowering fog. Some days my chest still tightened at memories, and other days it felt light enough to breathe. Sadness lived with us, like an honest tenant. It paid rent in quiet nights and memories, and we kept it because it was proof of love, not a burden to be erased. Closure wasn't a single door slamming shut. It was a series of small finishes, a final bill paid, a name removed from a lease, an apology that tasted thin but landed where it needed to. I learned to let go of calling him by his worst name. I called him what he was, a man who chose poorly, who will carry those choices. Naming him less often was a mercy I gave myself. People asked if I felt vindicated. I did, in a way that surprised me, but the satisfaction wasn't sweet, so much as clean. It felt like laundry washed and hung in the sun, visible, honest, not perfumed for show. There were nights I replayed the moments of the plan, wondering if any of it had hardened me in ways I couldn't see. At times I feared I had become too clever at looking for betrayal. But then my Vaita would tell a joke, or the two of us would sit with cups of tea and do nothing at all, and I'd remember why I had done what I did. It wasn't for sport. It was for her. The man who ruined so much paid in the currency he valued, reputation, money, comfort. He lost what had been easy to him. I watched him learn humility the hard way. I do not celebrate his ruin. I acknowledge it, and I accept that consequences are sometimes the only language some people understand. That acceptance felt like a heavy, honest thing. Life, oddly, felt more possible afterwards. The routines I once hated became small blessings again. Grocery runs, late-night TV, the way the tea steam fogs up the kitchen window in winter. I allowed myself small joys without guilt. A newspaper read in silence, a walk to the park, the way my daughter's hair smelled after a shower. They were tiny, defiant celebrations of what remained. There was a new caution in me, too, a gentleness toward trusting, a sharpened eye for patterns that might hide cruelty. But I guarded it so it would be protection, not armor that kept warmth out. Sometimes I would stand at the balcony with a cup of tea and think about mercy. Revenge had been a tool, but mercy, offering it or withholding it, felt like the last real power we possess. I forgave him only to the extent that I could stop letting him live inside my anger. Forgiveness did not mean forgetting. It meant refusing to let his cruelty define the rest of my days. My daughter started to stitch herself back together in ways I hadn't dared imagine. A small job, a friend who was steady, a laugh that returned like a shy bird. Watching that recovery was my real victory. If there is one truth I want you to carry from this, it is this: justice matters. It is not always brutal, and it is not always immediate, but it is necessary when dignity has been stolen. Also understand this: revenge can be a teacher. It taught me patience, precision, and that the law and community, not lonely fury, are the means to lasting consequence. But hear me clearly. Anger is not the same as joy. It can clear a wrong, but it cannot fill all the hollow places grief leaves. Only love, steady work, and time do that. So build your life around what endures: family, truth, service. Not the satisfaction of seeing someone fall. Use justice to protect, not to consume yourself. In the end, I learned that strength is not only in the strike, but in knowing when to stop striking. That restraint is where dignity lives. We survived. We healed, imperfectly and tenderly. And in that healing I found a new kind of power, the power to live, despite what was taken, and to teach my daughter how to choose better for herself. If you take away anything from this story, let it be this. Protect those you love fiercely. Hold people accountable when they betray that trust. But do not let your life be defined by the blows you deliver. Let your life be defined by what you rebuild. That is the true, stubborn, unvanquishable victory.